So we're in chapter 26 of your world history book, and we went over what was going on during this Cold War period in the Middle East, focusing in on Israel becoming a nation and the wars of Israel, onto the PLO in Lebanon, and into the Iraq and Iranian war. So now we're going to go a little bit to the east and to India and India's independence movement after World War II. As we know, Britain, in its weary state as being war-torn, had given up many of its colonies, and including India. So in the 1900s, India's leaders were in a struggle for independence even before the world wars. And so they had struggled much as they wanted independence from Great Britain. Two of the leaders, Mahatma Gandhi, I'm sure you've heard of Gandhi, and Jawaharlal Nehru. So both advocated civil disobedience against the British government. So they wanted to sever from the British government. And both of them were very Hindu. They were fanatical Hinduism. And they were influenced by what's called the Fabian socialism of the British society. So they were not only Hindu, but they were also socialists in wanting the government to control the people. And in India, even during that time and even today, there's a lot of poverty, strict poverty in India. In 1947, this is before 1948 when Israel became a nation, India received its independence from Great Britain. That's after World War II, as I said. So here's some pictures. Here's Nehru and Gandhi. And then, of course, here's a statue of the independence from Great Britain and some of the leaders in the fight against independence even back in the 1900s. And the establishment of India as an independent nation. Nehru and Indira Gandhi. So Nehru is the first prime minister until his death in 1964. He and his daughter, here's a picture of her now, this is she's older then in that picture, ruled or became the prime minister. He became the prime minister, and then later on she would be the prime minister of India between 1966 and 1977. In 1984, she was assassinated by Sikh militants, and her son, Rajiv Gandhi, right there, was prime minister in 1989, and he was removed from office due to corruption. Corruption, you think embezzlement, money problems. I don't know exactly. I didn't research that, but they knew there was corruption, so they took him off, out of office. And then in 1991, he was assassinated. So we have Nehru, onto Indira Gandhi, and onto Rajiv Gandhi, and all this going on. So you can see a lot of political unrest in India, especially the assassination of two of their leaders. India's socialism. Remember I told you it was like Fabian socialism, came out of England, and their government was influenced even with Gandhi and on to Indira Gandhi. They relied on socialism. Not so as representative republicanism, but socialism. India's socialism turned to planning and social engineering. I don't even like the word social engineering, because what does that mean? You're trying to engineer the people? Well, this weakened the nation's economy, and it created more misery and wretchedness for millions of people. There was widespread ethnic and religious unrest throughout the whole country. Sikh militants in Punjab, Muslim Sikh. Now, most of India is Hindu. We went over what the Hinduism. They have many, many gods, and a very idealistic type of religion, and believing in reincarnation and all these. And then we have the Sikh militants in Punjab, which were Muslim, and so they have two different religions colliding even today. So these militants put down the government troops, and the Sikhs assassinated the leaders. Hinduism was very superstitious, and socialism hindered the process in India. As the government tried to control the people would rely on the government, go into poverty. And of course, the Hindu superstition, they would not even, kill a cow to eat a cow because of their beliefs in reincarnation. Just, a lot of poverty, a lot of sickness, a lot of starvation, these things going on in the midst. We have this here, the Constitution of India. We, the people of India, having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign socialist, secular, democratic republic. So they focused on socialism. Not quite communism yet, but it's not too far from communism. So, but India's did advance in some chemical dyeing of cloth and tanning of leather and manufacturing of glass and soap and refining iron ore. So it did have some businesses that flourished in the midst of all of this. But India's socialism would be a handicap for growth, financial growth, and spiritual growth in India. So, India. Okay, now we're going to get into our turmoils in Africa. So as we look, we see communism and socialism. We see the socialism, and here's India here. Here's Asia, all of China and Russia, communist. You can see how we went over the involvement of communism in South America and Central America there. Now we got Africa. So what's happening in Africa? So the European powers intended to prepare African colonies for independence after World War II. But communist agitators and infiltrators and various movements of independence clamored for, "We want independence now." And the United States granted independence to these people who had little or no experience in self-government. They did not know how to govern their nations. Many Africans fell to communist terrorism and subversion. 50 sovereign states started, and they patterned first after parliamentary governments similar to England's government and France's government, right? But they most quickly succumbed to military dictatorships or one-party systems onto communism. In 1970, the African political leaders were under the influence of communism. The Soviet Union and Cuban troops, now we're thinking of Cuba, so Cuba's way over in this area, right? But of course we have Fidel Castro being, the example of communism, and them coming in, their troops coming in, assisted these leftist governments in violent revolts in Africa and border wars. So, what happened? Let's go over that just a little bit. What happened in Africa? So after World War II, these were colonies of European countries such as France, Belgium, Spain, and England, and they all set their colonies free. The United Nations set them to be free people, so they had independence, but they did not know how to even organize their government. And so what would happen is the communists would send in military people, dictators, or train the military dictators in that area, and sneak in and cause all the turmoils to become worse. And we want independence now. And that's what communism does. It comes in and brings turmoil, no matter what. Turmoil in race wars and turmoils in labor wars, anything that it could get the people to be totally in turmoil and against each other, civil wars. And then the communists come in and say, hey, we have the answer. And they send in their dictator, their communist dictator, or they put a puppet dictator of communism in control. So that's how they do things under communist governments. So and that's what's happening with these African countries. We're going to go over a couple of them here. Ghana. So Ghana, you see, here's Africa, and here's Ghana right here. Small country right here. It was formerly called the Gold Coast. In 1957, the first African nation, it was the first African nation south of the Sahara to gain independence. Kwame and Nkrumah became the leader, the prime minister. He was an idol, everyone looking up to him, of African nationalists, and everyone thought he was going to be this great model for democracy. So they had high hopes for him, for Kwame and Nkrumah, and you say Nkrumah, I guess, is how you pronounce it. But soon he began censoring opposition. So anyone that opposed him, he would censor them. In 1966, he became an outright dictator and later was overthrown by a military coup. He was also the leader of the Organized of African Unity, trying to unify the countries, but as dictator he failed. He failed in that point of being a free country, bringing it under the dictatorship that they needed to come away with, really. Ghana wavered during this period between military rule and nationalism because of what was going on and because of his leadership. The Congo, Belgium's African colony. So we have Belgium's colony, and it was the largest country with most numerous tribes, and they had no ethnic unity at all. We're talking about they were jungle tribes, and the tribes themselves didn't even get along. So in Belgium, Belgium having them as a colony never prepared them for any self-government. They were very primitive, and they did not know how to govern themselves at all. In 1960, the Belgian Congo became the independent Republic of Congo. So here they are independent. They don't know how to run their country, and civil war broke out all over. Civil war. Who's going to be the leader? It would have to be a dictator, as the Soviet Union sent technical assistants, they called them, and supplies to aid a pro-communist leader, thinking this country is so broken up. Let's get it so broken that we can just send a dictator in, a communist dictator, to lead this country into communism. So the premier, Lumumba was his name. His name's Lumumba here. Attacked the Europeans. There were a lot of Christians in the Congo. There were a lot of Belgians, but there were also a lot of Christians. So Premier Lumumba attacked any Europeans that were there, or any Americans that were there. And the Belgians then sent troops to try to protect them. And the United Nations even sent some troops in there. They sent in some African troops. Basically, the United Nations did little about this whole turmoil in the Congo. Violence in the Congo. Violence and unrest continued. And then there was the assassination of Premier Lumumba. Remember I told about him? Here he is, his assassination. And in 1964, there was a bloodbath that was supported by Marxist terrorists, similar to Stalin and Hitler. So what happened here? We have thousands and hundreds of thousands of Congolese are being executed by the communist Marxist dictators as they came in, just like they did in China, just like they did in Russia, killing all of these people. In one case, 2,000 Americans and Europeans were taken hostage in the center of the Congo in a town called Stanleyville. You know, Stanleyville, and in that town there were a lot of Christian missionaries. Most of these Americans that were there were missionaries. And so the United States came to help them, dropped 600 Belgian paratroopers to rescue these hostages. But minutes before they arrived, 29 of them were murdered, mostly Americans. Dr. Paul Carlson here was an American medical missionary. He was murdered along with his missionaries, and he saw so many Christians. In fact, before this, he said, in this century, more Christians have been martyred than of all the earlier centuries, which we think as the days of the martyr. He said, there's been more Christians martyred here in Africa than all of time. So you can imagine. Well, we know there's going to be a lot of martyrs in heaven, right? So the Congo massacre and what happened there in the midst. Here's a picture of him helping the people. He's a doctor and helping the people there and sharing the gospel, you know, so. And so, violence in the Congo. So Joseph Mobutu Sese Seko, right there. Joseph Mobutu Sese Seko, okay? He changed Congo to now the Zaire. The Congo Republic, it was the Republic of Congo, and he would change the Congo's name. Here's Africa, and here's where the Congo is, right in the midst of the jungle there. He renamed it as he did not want any names, European names of anything in everything. So all of his cities, everything was renamed to have African names. No more European names, he said. Zaire, though, remained economically, politically, and socially unstable. Nobody would want to go to Zaire. And he controlled as the dictator, purely African. So if you were European, if you were Christian, you would be persecuted in Zaire. Other African nations. So Algeria. We'll go through these pretty quick. I'm not going to go through them all, but if you study this, it happens very typically where the communist government started taking over a lot of these countries that had newly become independent. Algeria got its independence from France in 1962, and following a communist-provoked guerrilla war. So we have Algeria being controlled by communism. On to Nigeria. We have Nigeria that's right here, and here's a picture of Nigeria right there. Independence in 1967, and it was one of the most populated of black nations. Nigeria, a lot of Christians in Nigeria. The oldest African nations, though, were the Republic of Liberia. That's where basically the United States helped Liberia get started, freedom, where any slaves that would want to come back to Africa were brought to Liberia, always considered a free country. And on to Ethiopia, right here. Ethiopia, the Republic, or actually Kingdom of Abyssinia was considered Ethiopia here. One of the oldest, actually, I think the oldest of countries in Africa. Libya and Uganda. So the dictator in Libya, where we have up here Libya, was Muammar al-Gaddafi, dictator. And he supported General Idi Amin. Here is a picture of Muammar al-Gaddafi. Here's Idi Amin. And Idi Amin seized the power of Uganda. And so, that became ruled by a dictator, communist type rule, but a total dictator. So we have Libya here, and we have Uganda here. So Idi Amin killed and tortured over 300,000 people. He claimed to be a devout Muslim, and he killed anyone who was not Muslim. So both being Muslim type communist countries, Muslim dictatorships, a despot, terrible. So Ethiopia, let's go back to Ethiopia. Ethiopia, the family ruled there. A family ruled Ethiopia for 1,000 years, and they claimed to be descendants of the Queen of Sheba from the Bible. But the last monarch was Haile Selassie. Here's Haile Selassie. He lived 1892 to 1975. In 1970, Ethiopia had a written constitution. It had a parliament. It had a court system. It had programs to improve its transportation, education, and agriculture. It was flourishing. Here's Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, being it as flourished as a country. In 1974, Selassie was running the country as an independent free country. He was overthrown by a military coup who murdered Haile Selassie. They murdered him. And then, as the coup came in and communism type government came in, hundreds of thousands of people were starved to death. And Ethiopia became probably the poorest country in Africa, and children being starved to death. Terrible, terrible. So in 1970s, by a communist-induced famine, which happened in China, which happened in Russia. The communists basically, the farmers who were producing, those that were producing food and stuff, they killed them and murdered them, and basically had no food, and they were starving and starved these people to death. This Marxist is called social engineering. I would call social engineering as starving people to death, is what one of the things they do. They take over all the businesses and all the farmers and everything, and they socially engineer them into the government. And in doing this, they end up having famines and kill people by starvation. That's social engineering. And it was aided here in Ethiopia by the Soviet Union, Russia, and Cuban troops came in and took over Ethiopia when Haile Selassie was a grand and vibrant Christian leader of Ethiopia and was murdered. South Africa is the last one we're going to go over here. South Africa, of course, the south tip of Africa. In 1950s, the United Nations frequently denounced South Africa for the policy of racial segregation. They called this apartheid. So what was apartheid? It meant the blacks and the whites would be segregated in South Africa. The UN was so focused on racism. Now, of course, they had problems of racism, but they ignored the atrocities of the Marxist terrorists that came against these black communities. So they had, of course, the Soviet Union and Cuba had sent in Marxist terrorists in the midst of this to get things worse. They always, communism, not always, but in many areas, focuses on racial unrest. So they love to go into the countries with a lot of racial unrest, and they did in South Africa. The communists terrorized the people, discouraged any opposition from them, and coerced them to support the movement. So basically, we have in South Africa, we have the very poverty-stricken and the races not knowing how to really rule themselves at that point, and going towards these Marxist leaders, these communist leaders for help. In 1961, South Africa declared itself a republic, right? and left the Commonwealth of Great Britain. England controlled South America. England and the Dutch, actually. And you can look back in history at that. But so in 1961, South Africa becomes independent. Right away, Marxist means communist, agitators infiltrated the African National Congress and the Pan-Africans and to get their foot into South Africa. South Africa responded by creating separate homelands for blacks to have their own independent state, basically saying, okay, we'll help you, South Africa, in trying to put together in the midst of all this and the rebellion that was promoted by a communist country, saying, we'll help you with your own homelands, but they were considered apartheid. They were considered a racist even in doing this. In 1976, there were more riots that happened. And can you believe it? The riots started over the use of the African language taught in the schools. So basically, they would take any little problem and make it into huge divisions, and the killing of people. And so here they started. They wanted to use the African language and taught in the schools. They said it was apartheid, all these things, and people were killed. 600 blacks were killed in the midst of all this. And again, the socialistic and communist, and here we have later on Nelson Mandela, but we'll talk about him later on. It comes later on in history. So I'm just saying, what unrest. So going back, as we can see, the same thing happened in many of these countries. And the sad thing is that as communism came in, people were put into bondage. And so this is the history of communism. So when think of communists coming in, American socialists and liberalism and all this stuff coming in, this is where it leads. It leads into bondage. And they always want to get rid of, number one, Christians, especially born-again Christians, because communism and socialism, humanism, all of these things, part of the enemy's ways of taking away the freedom there is in the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ.